Good evening. Today I wanted to talk about the impact of adolescent marijuana use on intelligence because I've seen there be a lot of misinformation about this topic, or a lot of studies have been done, but they've been kind of murky in a way that we can't point to clearly for data now, because they cannot explain familial or environmental factors, and they can't bring any what would be significant numbers outside of that range. So this is a more recent study among two test participants, and I wanted to go over the key points of it. I want to explain how it works, the conclusion, and what should be the takeaway after reading it. All right. So the study is set up with its two longitudinal studies of adolescent twins. And a longitudinal study just means it takes place over a long period of time, with periodic checkups to ensure progress or ensure like consistent data points. And these longitudinal studies usually take place over multiple years to multiple decades even. They're longer form science types. Now, those two studies contributed. Con- those two studies consisted of 789 participants and 2,277 participants, and they were quasi-experimental. Now, quasi-experimental is just meant to explain, like, I think most people know that in a scientific experiment with participants, you want to choose these participants relatively randomly because whatever data set you find, you want to be able to apply to the general public. So if you cherry pick your contestants, you can't be sure that the data will apply to the public. And quasi experimental means that they still want to stay true to that, in that they want to have semi-random contestants to ensure that like a broader range of different race or gender or age groups within standards. But they want to make sure that it applies to most people, but also they can't be too random where they might not have enough potential marijuana users in the future to get data points from. So the terms I believe they went for in this study was quasi-experimental, meaning that they were like looking for troubled students or youths that were in trouble with the law, or just like key signs that indicate later marijuana usage, so they can be sure there would be users to get data points from later in the study. So the participants were tested on intelligence with like just like IQ test for vocabulary, their diction, their pattern recognition, and their just arithmetic skills. Just standard IQ stuff at 9 to 12, which is their quote unquote pre cannabis phase. And then for the final endpoint, they were tested again at 17 to 20. And the marijuana use was self reported. It was just to know who was using marijuana and also the quantity to later show. You'll see why it's important. Actually, you'll see right here because the idea was if marijuana was causing a cognitive decline in the youths or the adolescents that were using them, three things would be true. The marijuana should precede cognitive decline, meaning it should come before cognitive decline. There needs to be a dose relationship that exists, and a dose relationship just means like very simple numbers here, and obviously makes no sense, but I think it will. Let's say someone were to be given 5 marijuanas, and if a dose relationship existed, theoretically you could say something along the lines of 5 marijuanas means 5 IQ points off their future cognitive tests. It's a very simple ratio that can be repeated over multiple contestants over multiple times, just to be sure that it exists. With other drugs or substances that cause cognitive decline, a dose relationship exists. So that'll be true. And then the third one will be an association still exists after adjusting for familial and environmental factors, which just means that, especially with quasi experimental studies, you have to be careful because your contestants are going to be chosen because of certain factors you're looking for that could indicate later behavior. So you have to plan for whatever results you find to be outside of that threshold so they can still be proven significant even if they're genetically predispositioned to still act in these certain ways that you've been seeking. It just means that the numbers have to be significant enough to like point and look, say, there. You cannot deny that. That's too obvious. So there are many forms of intelligence, but there's only two that are really emphasized in the study, which is fluid and crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence just means, you never guess it, it's acting fluidly. It's adapting to new environments, new situations, being able to think on the fly. Examples are like navigating a new city, because you can still use previous experience with navigation on that, but it's a new environment, new situation. Or in-depth conversation with unfamiliar counterparts, which just means you're trying to feel this person out, see what conversation works best for them, and you're drawing on previous conversation experience. That one isn't looked at too heavily in the study. The one that's really measured in the study and like the closest coming to a positive for a trend in cognitive decline or cognitive effect is crystallized intelligence, which just means building off of previous experiences, reusing information from formative times. Like example would be learning anything in school. If you're in middle school and you have a vocabulary test and you cram for it and you pass the vocab test, you'll probably use that vocabulary well into your adult life, and that's your crystallized intelligence. It's solid data you have in your formative years that you still use today, and you build off of it. It's like recalling facts, etc. Now the difference in these is for fluid intelligence, that peaks in your early adulthood and then it falls off a cliff as you get older. One of the first thing to go in seniors, they can't like adapt to a wildly new situation. But with crystallized intelligence, it actually continues growing and remains stable through most of your adult life, and it's one of the last things you'll see go when a person is aging, quote unquote, out of their mind. The latter is what's being really tested here. So the study is important because roughly 19% of youth 18 to 25 in the U.S. uses marijuana. It's become a very normalized drug. It's hard to not see it that way, especially in the current education system. It's a very obvious what might be a con of our society right now. I'm going to keep my perspective out of it. So it also talks of decriminalizing marijuana in more regions, and the crossing the bridge metaphor just means imagine you're on one side of the bridge and marijuana's on the other, and the bridge is like a legal boundary. You have to cross those legal boundaries to get to marijuana, and the reason is if you cross it to get to marijuana, this very low class drug that will have, if any, considerably less effects than other harder substances around it also on that side of the bridge. While you've already crossed this bridge, it'll be much easier for you to do mental gymnastics and say, well, I'll just cross it again because I've done it before. So go to like cocaine or some other harder LSD or anything like that. Actually, LSD isn't. That's a later video. But by keeping marijuana on the same side of the bridge that you're on, which is legal, it makes it so you still have that barrier in your mind of, well, it's illegal to go for the harder substances. That's just that whole argument going on is why it's important to read these studies. And also, it's also true that for youths, there's more neurocognitive function vulnerability as your brain's developing. Your brain only really develops, I believe, around 24 or 25. We've decided on. So until then, it's common sense. You probably just shouldn't be trying drugs that like alter your brain or like go into your blood-brain barrier, which marijuana does, depending on how you ingest it. But yeah, it's just like for youth especially, any substance or any drug is going to be a negative, possibly during your development of their brain. And then there's also difficulty on deciding accurate measurements with previous studies when put against confounding variables, and these confounding variables being, again, familial, genetic, environmental factors. The numbers that previous studies found were either not significant enough to point to a correlation, or sorry, causation. That's an important one. Or they were just, the tests themselves were kind of debunked and shown to not be accurate. So it's important to go over again with a more recent one, which is this one. Now, the numbers that were found, you can see RFAB stands for the Rochester Family and Adolescent Brain Study, and MTFS is a Minnesota Twin Family Study, which is the two sample sizes I talked about earlier. And so this chart's measuring crystallized intelligence and emphasize correlation versus causation again. There's a difference of -1 to 2 IQ points in the pre and post cognitive tests, IQ tests, whatever they're doing to test the cognitive function of these test subjects, participants. So this is basically just saying that among users, there is 1 to 2 less IQ points with these tests than non-users. But the problem is, again, because of the quasi-experimental thing, we were choosing these subjects because they indicated acting in a certain way later in their life that would hint towards us getting strong data points that would be useful for the study. But at the same time, them acting this way also means other things are going to be true genetically about them, which could just be them naturally performing worse on these cognitive tests. All that is to say, the numbers that are on this chart are not nearly significant enough for us to point to and say, this is true about adolescent marijuana use. You can also see there's a lack of dose-response relationship which just means that among these different sibling dynamics among users and non-users, you cannot tell, especially for subjects that were saying they were using much harder than other people. You cannot tell a significant difference in those versus light users versus non-users that would indicate like a set ratio of marijuana usage in your adolescence to decline in cognitive function later in your life. All right. So the conclusion, I just want to restate it again. There is not significant data to support the idea that adolescent marijuana usage causes cognitive decline, at least not in crystallized or in fluid intelligence, which are the two primary ones. The exact wording, an absence of meaningful differences between discordant siblings leads us to conclude that the deficits observed in marijuana users are attributable to confounding factors that influence both substance initiation and IQ rather than a neurotoxic effect in marijuana. Neurotoxic just means toxicity to your neurons in your brain as you're developing adolescent. Of course, it's just going to mean that it's going to harm your brain development. So, while some could look at this study and say there is no evidence for adolescent marijuana usage to hurt me later on in life, that you can look at it that way. That's totally fine. But just remember, common sense. Your brain is developing right now. This is a drug that enters your brain to give you this high. Same with other substances. So maybe just avoid them, at least in your early adolescence, for as long as you can hold off to. If you want to, like, no studies 100%. Conclusion, the study doesn't support any cognitive decline, but try and stay away when you're really young. That's all I wanted to say. All right. I'm going to leave any corrections I have for this video. I'm going to look over it again in the top comments or the description. And I hope you have a good day.